Good morning. I also have to apologize because my French is also so embarrassing that if I tried, I couldn't speak to you that way. I'm thrilled to be here. It's really an exciting time to be talking about what's going on at the Post, both because exciting things have been going on at the Post and also because we had this really interesting national election that was hard to predict. And it gave the Post an opportunity to really try some new things, because what better time to try some new things than when you have your most important news event. Just to put a little bit of context, the Post has gone through a really significant reinvention in the last 3 years. And I won't belabor this, but I do think it's an important place to start from, which is, one, the Post has a really wonderful reputation, but that reputation is really grounded, for many people, in the reporting of the early 1970s. And it was great, but we can't only talk about Watergate at the Washington Post, and we certainly don't want our readers to only think about us as Watergate. And almost 3 years ago now, Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, bought the Post, him personally, not Amazon. And that really did change things. It changed things because it gave us more resources and more opportunity. And it's not that it changed our editorial focus, but it certainly changed how we think about technology. And I hope you'll see that in some of the things we were doing to cover the election. And that collectively, this grand tradition of reporting, I don't know. We'll figure out the slides in a second. Oh, we're back. This grand tradition of reporting plus this new focus on technology has allowed us to do some things that we wouldn't have been able to do before. And the proof of that is in the audience growth. So Bezos bought the Post in October of 2013, and at the time we had about 30 million users in the US, monthly unique visitors, and now we have about 100 million. So the audience has been growing pretty steadily, and hopefully that's a little bit proof that some of the things I'm going to talk about worked. One of the big challenges for us, and I think for many news organizations, is the question of what it is that we do. That originally there wasn't so much of a question because we had a single product. And that single product, at least at the Post, was the newspaper. And we're very proud that the newspaper has published for almost 140 years, and yet that's not really all that we do. So starting about 20 years ago, we added a website, and in 2008 we added some apps, and now we have several different apps. We actually have some chatbots, not as clever as Martin's, but pretty good. And yet, that's not really what we make. And so we had to go through this process where we had to identify what is the thing we care most about, what is the thing that we actually do. And the thing that we do is we make stories. So this is supposed to be a story. And when we got to that point, when we started to think about our storytelling as the atomic unit of what we make, of the product that we distribute, we felt pretty good. But that still wasn't actually true. That is not what we make. What we make are the elements of the stories. And this is really important, at least for the Post, because we had to start to think about how do the individual pieces of a story represent themselves when we are not the sole distribution source. So the photos, the video, the graphics, the text, the informational graphics, audio if we have it, all of those pieces are really important storytelling elements. And the challenge for us is that the photo that sits atop a story on our website may also live on Instagram. And when it's atop our website on a news story, we may have 5,000 words. But when we tell that same story on Instagram with one photo, we have about 500 characters. And those 500 characters have to communicate at least a semblance of what those 5,000 words do. And that is a really significant challenge. And the reason that this becomes so important is because we're taking those individual elements and we are distributing them everywhere. And as we distribute our stories across many, many more platforms that we don't control than platforms we do control, we have to think about how those elements will be interpreted by our audience. And we actually tell a variety of different stories these days. We used to tell only, do you talk about the inverted pyramid? The sort of classic news story, we put the most important thing on top and the least important thing as you work your way down. Well, effectively, those stories just don't work for us digitally anymore. They don't really work in print, but they especially don't work digitally. Because digitally, you know what you need, and what you need is usually the most new and novel things. And the truth of it is, the thing that differentiates us are the variety of presentational styles that we can offer. And at the very beginning, right after he bought the Post, Jeff Bezos asked our executive editor, Marty Barron, he said, let me see if I understand your business model. And he said, I think what you do is that you spend months at a time doing really great investigative work. You put that story online, and 15 minutes later, all of your competitors copy it and post it too. And we said, well, Marty said, no, 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 I'm sure it's not that. It's not that at all. And after some uncomfortable silence, he said, well, maybe it's that. And Jeff said, so what can you do about this? It seems like some of your stories you really invest in the presentation. And he said, yes. And he said, well, do they copy those in 15 minutes? And we said, no. And he said, well, maybe you should start to think about the ways you tell stories instead of just telling all of your stories in a way that can be copied in 15 minutes. And what you see across these different types of media is an increasing level of immersion, experientialness to the stories, that you can be more deeply captured by some of these stories. But the truth of it is, if when you look at our stories across this continuum, it looks a lot more like this, meaning that almost all of our stories are linear, that you start at the bottom and you go as far as you want, but you don't make choices, you don't have any deep engagement. And so the real challenge for us is, if most of our stories are linear, and most of our stories can be copied, what is valuable to us about the news that we distribute? And part of what's valuable is if we, A, can tell a deeper, more unique story than anyone else. Doesn't matter if it's easy to copy, at least we would be the first to share that news. And B, well, either we have unique news or we're the first to share the news that we have. And so being the first to share the news is great, but we suddenly are competing with everyone, not just other news organizations, but Reuters and the Associated Press. And so we need some other tools that help us with the presentation of this information. So we built a system we're calling Heliograph. And the idea behind Heliograph is that it takes data and then it writes stories out of the data without human intervention. So as the data rolls in, the stories come out. And the first time we used this publicly was for the Olympics. And in 2012, the Post had several editors who spent all of their time watching television and writing down what they saw out of these Olympic events. This isn't a really great use of human time, but it's what we had to do. And so in 2016, we wanted to do it differently. So what we did is we took data from the IOC through Stats Inc., and then our journalists built templates, and into those templates flowed the data, and out came simple stories and tweets, Slack messages, and information that went to Amazon Echo, and a Facebook Messenger app, actually. And the value of this for us was less that we have the information, because we had the information in 2012, but more that we could have the information nearly instantly, and that we could use those same humans to write about stories that we wouldn't have been able to get watching TV. And so this was pretty valuable. We published about 300 blog posts, tweets, updates, and we wanted to expand on it for the election. And so for the election, we dreamed a little bit bigger, and we built a different kind of system. The system we built for the election was pretty interesting because we wanted to cover all 435 House races, all 34 Senate seats, and all 12 gubernatorial races. We also wanted to sum up what happened in all 50 states, and we wanted to talk about slates of candidates, candidates who had been recommended, endorsed, had advertising bought for them by the Koch brothers or Emily's List or the NRA, other groups that reach across the political spectrum. And what we wanted to do, instead of making a singular story, is we wanted to be able to tell stories that could evolve over time. And so with all of these 500 plus stories, we started life as a preview. So we took in a bunch of data, how people had performed historically in specific geographies, the backgrounds of the candidates, any analysis we had about the race, and we published previews for all those stories. And then, as the polls opened on Election Day, on November 8th, we updated the stories again. And we said, okay, now the polls are opening, here's where to watch. And then, when the polls closed, every minute we updated the results of the race, and we actually shifted around elements in the story depending on who was ahead and depending on what percentage of the vote was in. And then, as individual races were called, we updated the stories once again, and we were putting those stories in context of the other races. So if you're looking at a US House race, how are the other races for the House going? We very specifically did not cover the presidential election because we were trying to differentiate ourselves from what our human coverage would do better. So we had lots of humans who were both covering the congressional election and especially the presidential election. And when there was human coverage on a subject, we either brought it into our automated coverage, and I'll talk about how in a second, or we just swapped out, if there was an individual House race we were going to cover, we swapped out the systems coverage, the machines coverage, for the human coverage. And what's interesting about these automated stories is how they come together. So when we think about almost all the automated stories we talk about, and the Associated Press is doing this with a company called Automated Insights, and the New York Times did a little bit of this even on election night, we talk about how do we take structured data, how do we put it into our magic template, which is essentially a black box and you don't know what's going to happen, and then out pop stories. And those stories are very much like what you would get off the wire. They're very finite. And so what we wanted to do with our election is have these more living stories, these stories that were evolving depending on what the data saw, that were changing over time. But really, the future of these stories for us, let me compare it to human stories. So let's talk about what reporters actually do. So what reporters actually do is they do unstructured reporting. They go and find data. Sometimes that data has some structure to it. Often, it's interviews, it's questions they asked, it's things they dug up. Then they apply their own actual intelligence, and they write traditional stories. What we really want to do are hybrid stories. This is the most value and the most interest to the Washington Post. These hybrid stories are a combination of humans plus data. And then a combination of human intelligence that's helping to interpret, but also the machine is helping to interpret, and then collectively crafting a story. And the stories can have many, many outputs. Part of the value of a system like this is the ability to craft all kinds of outputs, that we can generate hopefully more lifelike chat messages, that we can communicate with you on the Echo or the Google Home, in this audio computing in the way that you want. That for some people we can make a brief, for other people we can make a longer story, for some people we can make an informational graphic, and for others we can generate audio or video. And these hybrid stories are very deliberately meant to be a combination of the two. Because if we can tell the story with data alone, it's very, very easy to copy, where if we can combine the data with our human reporting, we can create something that's more valuable, but also save the humans time. That we have about 700 journalists, some really amazing reporters at the Washington Post, and the last thing we ever want them to do is report on something that with structured data we can do an equal job or even a slightly lesser job, then we are wasting the time of these very valuable humans. And really, our long-term goal is personalization and customization. That we want to be able to give you news that makes sense for you. And there are a variety of factors that we're looking at in that way. One example of how we've done this in the past is how we covered the story of the real estate crash and rebound in the United States. And so in this particular case, we asked for user input. So in this case, I'm changing New York to my neighborhood in Washington, D.C., and this is the Capitol Hill neighborhood. And then all of a sudden, the map and some of the graphics in the story are changed to reflect my particular life. And as we go through the story, a whole bunch of different places in the story, we're customizing it for how does your individual US zip code fare. And this starts to get at a much more valuable story because I can read a broad trend story and very easily say that it doesn't apply to me. But if we can customize a story so we can find ways that it does apply to you, it's so much more valuable. And so this broader question is, when is automation the answer? When is it important? And I actually think the grocery store is a really interesting place to compare. So if one example of how you shop at the grocery store is you take your shopping cart through the grocery store, you load it with groceries, you come to the checkout line, and someone checks you out, how does that compare to the experience of you checking out yourself? I would contend that despite its promise, self-checkout is always worse, that you are always worse at checking out your own groceries than you were at having another human check out your own groceries. That it is a slower, more painful process, that you can't weigh things correctly, that you lose the SKU numbers, that the zip codes don't read. I don't know if any of this translates from the States, but I think it does. And in doing so, we sort of lost sight of what actually we wanted out of a grocery store experience. It's not this. It's not that anyone wanted to walk down a store chock full of 1,000 different products, all of which are essentially the same, under fluorescent lighting that's really uncomfortable. What we love about grocery shopping when we love it is being at a farmer's market, being outside, hand-selecting the produce we want. And that has nothing to do with our breakfast cereal or our boxed pasta or any of those other staples of the grocery store experience. That what we want out of that experience, out of this sort of what are my staples experience, is we want to purchase the groceries and we want them in our homes. And so it's not necessarily self-checkout that we want, but rather perhaps delivery of those items, so that we can decide which things we want completely automated and which things we want to have a say in the process. So in essence, we want our humans to have the farmer's market experience of reporting and creating stories. And we want our automation to do all of the other things, the tasks where we want information, but we don't necessarily need as much interpretation and thought put into it. And so as we start to think about the automation of stories, what we need to think about on the personalization and customization is what do we know about you, and therefore how can we make a better story for you? So if our stories are going to be a combination of what the machine can tell you with what the human can provide, then we need to know what device are you on. Because, at least with our readership, the more likely you are to read a long story, it has everything to do with you not being on a mobile device. Therefore, on mobile devices, we need to give you much quicker and more to-the-point stories. We need to know what are your user habits. So if you come to the post regularly, how long do you spend with us in the morning? How long do you spend with us at midday? How long do you spend with us in the evening? For example, most of our long-form stories are consumed at night. And so maybe that's a better time to surface for you a longer story. Or maybe we would be smart to give you a short version of the story and promise you the longer version when you have time to read it. And finally, we can use your own browsing habits to help craft stories for you. So if you've been looking at Syria, we don't need to explain very much about the political situation in Syria. And if you haven't looked at Syria at all, then we really need to give you that background. And so this idea of these hybrid stories are essentially modular stories, where we show and hide bits of information depending on what you need and how much time we suspect you have. If you never look at video, let's not waste your time by showing you a video player, or at least move it way down in the story. So the goal at the Post is that we want to simultaneously be able to do both things. And our most recent Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting, I think, is a great example of this. We wanted to cover police shootings in the States. And so what we did is we built a database of every police shooting, not because any individual wants to look through 900 plus police shootings, but because that way we can draw valid conclusions and we can have utmost transparency. So this is the data set that we looked at, and you can look through it. And so the idea is not that we chase salacious news with our humans, not that we exile humans to some small corner of what we do, but that we use a combination of humans plus data to craft really exceptional stories.